As part of your proxy statement filed with the SEC, you will describe the qualifications and skills that led your board to conclude that each director and director nominee should serve as a director today on Zippy Point. I'm Brock Romnad, and I'm a big fan of yous. So before I bring on Leah and Candace to explain this disclosure in more detail, let's run down some of the basics, the legal requirements. Item 7B of Schedule 14A refers to Item 401 of Regulation SK, and then Part 3, Item 10 of Form 10K does as well, which typically incorporates, in the 10K typically incorporates the disclosure by reference from the proxy. That's the way it normally works. This information is elicited by Item 401E, specifically of Regulation SK. Note that Item 407C of Regulation SK requires disclosure about the nominating committee process, and the rest of Item 401 requires director biographical disclosure, which are the subject of two separate other vid guides. Links to those videos are beneath this one. Which directors to include? So you're going to include all your directors, even the ones that are not up for re-election for this annual meeting, but who will continue to serve on the board. So meaning that if you have a classified board, as noted in this Corp Fin staff interpretation, you will include those directors who aren't on the ballot for re-election this year. But you don't include those directors whose terms are expiring at this annual meeting, but they're not going to continue on. They're not on the ballot for re-election. What to disclose? Item 401E1 requires disclosure of the specific experience, qualifications, attributes, or skills that led to the conclusion that the person should serve as a director at the time the disclosure is made in the proxy in light of the company's business and structure. If material, this disclosure should cover more than the past 5 years, including information about the director's particular areas of expertise or other relevant qualifications. So your format can be flexible here. The SEC gives you the discretion to do what you want, and that's good news. Companies have really taken the ball in recent years and run with it, gotten really creative, just like they have for director bios. And I have a link to a vid guide about proxy design in this area for director qualifications and skills. Item 401E1 does not mandate any particular information or format for this disclosure. In some ways, that flexibility can pose a challenge. What do you include? Global experience, leadership experience, financial experience, public policy experience, risk experience leading companies in the company's industry, or a myriad of other qualities. Under Item 401E1, you have to link specific qualifications that director has to company-specific circumstances. And while Item 401E disclosure doesn't require you to include a discussion of the company's business and structure, a number of companies do this to help make that connection transparent. Disclosure of the specific experience, qualifications, or skills that qualify a person as a board committee member is not required unless an individual is chosen to be a director because of their particular experience, their particular qualifications related to service on a specific committee. So for example, this might commonly come up for the audit committee. Someone has a deep background with finance, and so they're recruited to be on the board because specifically they need that person on the audit committee. But it might be this kind of situation for other committees too. The compensation committee, now that ESG is becoming important, maybe someone's recruited because they're going to serve on a committee that's related to E&S. Board matrices. I love that word. Under this Corp Fin staff interpretation, you must cover each director on an individual basis. So there's a growing use of tabular matrices to illustrate the qualifications of the board as a group, the board composition. This voluntary disclosure is in addition to the mandated specific qualifications disclosure for each individual director. The growing popularity of including matrices in the proxy itself, not just having your board matrix for the board, for the corporate governance committee, for the nominating committee to consider when they're deciding to recruit a new director, but actually have it in the proxy. It's become popular in recent years because the New York City Comptroller encouraged companies starting a few years ago to do this, to disclose the director diversity attributes along with their director skills in a standardized matrix format that started back in 2017. Diversity disclosures. So this Corp Fin is a biggie here. It's about directors being selected as a director under and pursuant to a diversity policy, board diversity, a hot topic. Whether the directors self-identify with a specific diversity characteristic, whether it be race, gender, ethnicity, religion, nationality, disability, sexual orientation, or cultural background. And each director has consented to that sort of disclosure in the proxy. But there are limitations to this interpretation, to this corporate staff interp. It requires disclosure only when directors self-identify and consent to the disclosure, and when the board considered those characteristics in concluding that that individual should serve as a director, or otherwise has a policy that identifies the consideration of those diversity characteristics in identifying director nominees. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more with Leah and Candace, and then I have a separate vid guide about D&I disclosures, a link to which is beneath this with a big panel. A link to that video is beneath this one. Location in the proxy. So there's no required spot for this disclosure where it goes in the proxy. Logically, this disclosure belongs in the section where you have the director election disclosures. Often this director qualification and skills disclosure is a separate section, a separate paragraph following each director's bio information, or it's adjacent to the bio section, or it could be in a whole entirely different section altogether. A lot of companies now have a section in their proxy called the corporate governance section, and it might be in there. So let's look at a few examples. Here's one from Cognizant. This matrix is really nice, and then each bio has a lengthy description. Microsoft, they got the narrative about their process, and then this board composition graphic too, and then a skills matrix. They have all three. Here's Prudential skill matrix, and their skills and qualifications for each director are listed in their bios a few pages earlier. And then the Southern Company, a wonderful graphic highlighting their board composition. And then the qualifications are listed directly beneath their picture in each bio. So let's bring on Leah and Candace. Our guests today are Leah Huddleston and Candace Jackson. Leah is Vice President, Associate General Counsel, and Assistant Secretary at Brown-Forman in Louisville. She's been in-house at 3 public companies. Candace is at Mayer Brown Rowe in Chicago. She's been in-house at 2 public companies. They both went to the University of Michigan, as did I. I'm Brock Romanek, today on Zippy Point.
Quick Zips by Zippy Point.
Quick and dirty. So Leah, what's the typical process to collect the information for this director qualifications and skills disclosure? Do you go beyond the Do You Know questionnaire?
So it varies from company to company. Some companies use primarily or only the DNO questionnaire to collect this information, again, providing a draft of the information and allowing directors to review and make appropriate adjustments. I have, however, worked with companies where the board will create a competencies document or things that are necessary or important for a board, skills that are necessary for a board member to have. And then they will take that, those skills and put them into kind of a matrix form and then allow the directors to kind of rate each other in order to come up with the information that's required for this disclosure. But again, the practice varies. Sometimes it's internally folks drafting something for review and comment, but then I've seen it be a little more formulaic where directors rate each other, and then that kind of naturally feeds into the disclosure that's required.
So Candace, how closely do you ensure that each director actually reviews their own disclosure in this case?
You know, when you're disclosing skills and experience of a director, you absolutely should give them an opportunity to review it. I think it's a little bit tricky in this case because oftentimes the skills and the experience that the company lands on for each director don't always match up with the skills and experience that the director believes that they have. So sometimes it can turn into an exercise in convincing them that this is the appropriate information for the proxy for now, you know. But you know, a lot of times there can be pushback and directors wanting to include different or additional information. So it's a delicate dance, I would say.
In terms of ensuring that a director reviews their disclosure, it's, you use the DNO and you trust that the directors are reviewing it. I have seen companies sometimes they pre-populate and then they'll ask the director to check the box to ensure that they've reviewed their disclosure. In other spaces, you might even leave a blank question and allow the director to fill it out themselves. Back to, like thinking about consistency, like that can be a little dangerous because if you, kind of let a director write out what they think is appropriate, you might not have consistency. But
Right.
I think generally, the check the box and just relying on that they're directors and they have fiduciary obligations and they're just as interested in this disclosure as we are as securities law practitioners.
And Leah, what other disclosure controls have you seen for this? Have you seen anything else besides the questionnaire?
Yeah, so I actually keep an eye on LinkedIn profiles and their disclosures for other companies. So directors often sit on multiple public company boards or private companies. And so when I'm drafting the proxy statement, I want to go out and see what other companies are saying about this same director. I think it would be unfortunate if there was a skill or an attribute that, we deem to be strong and another company deems it to be weaker. And so just ensuring consistency as well. I also try to track news releases. People do their best to tell you what boards they sit on. And so just tracking kind of what's out there from a public perspective in terms of news and press releases as well. They don't say as much about like the assessment information, but it also is kind of a place to go and make sure you capture the world of disclosure for your particular director.
And Candace, I have a separate vid guide about proxy design and all the different formats that companies have been using for this kind of disclosure, and it's magnificent.
Yeah.
Are there any particular formats that you found useful?
I particularly prefer the format where there are a couple of sentences or a couple of bullet points that follow or appear somewhere near each director's bio. I'm not a huge fan of the matrix. And the reason is because I have seen so many disputes arise where a director sees all of the check marks that, his colleagues have next to their names and wants to know why he doesn't have a check mark next to that skill or, that qualification. And, the matrix can just cause some comparison issues between the directors. And so I like to just include a couple of bullet points or a couple of sentences after each director's bio about the particular skills and qualifications that make them a good candidate for the board. That way they're not comparing each other across the line.
I too, like you, Candace, I really like the bulleted format, the picture and a little bit about the director, where they worked, and then the qualifications. The SEC is encouraging plain English. I find that to be a great way for people to quickly kind of look through and see why a director makes sense in connection with their vote. So just anything to make it more reader friendly for the investor, I find to be the best approach. It's hard to read through those paragraphs. Takes more time. So anything that's plain English friendly, I like that approach better. Yeah. It's not always fair to put people in boxes. One person might be strong in an area, and that area is really critical for that organization, like an energy company. Like a director with energy experience may not have, experience in, say, communications or outreach.
So Leah, how do you link specific qualifications to companies' specific circumstances?
So I have seen companies that will develop a set of competencies or qualifications that they think make sense for board service. And then the companies or the directors can take a look at those and kind of align each director with those specific qualifications. And that can be a basis for providing the disclosure, using that set of data to steer the disclosure that's included in the proxy statements.
And Candace, how do you work in soft skills or attributes, the travel, martial arts, surfing kind of thing, or do you not? Because then you have to do it for every director, and you get sort of some real outliers.
You know, I don't see it often, although I imagine that in more creative industries that you would see it more. I think, you know, it would definitely be industry specific. So if it's a creative or even a tech space, I think those are the kind of things that investors are interested in, you know. And I do think for other industries, it can humanize the directors to show, you know, things that they're interested in outside of the business. So I don't think there's anything per se wrong with including that information. I don't, like I said, I don't see it often, but I do think it adds a human element to the disclosure.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Candace. I don't see that very often, or haven't in the spaces that I've been in as well. And again, once you put it in for one director, say they have a skill, do other directors feel like they need to include that as well? And you want to be have disclosure that's unique to each director. And so I think it could get a little tricky including those things, but haven't seen that as much in the spaces that I've worked in.
And we talked about this in the director bio vid guide that we taped together, but we might as well talk about it again. How do you assess disclosure parity for each director? Do you count the number of sentences or words, Leah?
Yeah, so I don't typically count words. It's more of a feel than anything else. Like, just because one director has 3 bullets, like, I don't necessarily believe that every other director needs to have 3. That being said, you do kind of want them to have the same look and feel. So it's a little bit more of the art than a science. I do, however, I'm very sensitive to ensuring that a director doesn't look underqualified. So say all other directors have 5 bullets next to their picture. If there's like 1, then, you know, that would kind of be a place where I'd want to pause, because that director could, you know, be the subject of an activist, or, you know, you don't want to have like reputational risk for that director. And so I look at it in the art form, just to the feel, but I don't go through and count words for each director.
I'd agree with that. I'd agree. You know, it's almost why I prefer a sentence structure than even a bullet structure, because with the bullets you can run into, well, how come they have 4 bullets and I only have 2 bullets? But I do think that when you know, if you put it in a couple of short sentences, it's a little bit easier to blend it all together. You know, if someone has multiple qualifications, or they have experience in multiple areas, you can create a quick short list in a sentence form, and then someone else's sentence can be a little more wordy to kind of visually make up for the fact that they have maybe fewer skills in the disclosure. So I do think if you run into that issue, you might consider switching from a bullet format to a sentence format to kind of visually even things out.
And then we have the issue of the day, a disclosure about diversity, you know, gender, racial, ethnic, sexual orientation. Candace, things are changing so fast in this. By the time we take this vid guide and people watch it, things might have changed, even in terms of SEC regulatory requirements. But what are you seeing?
You know, I think up until this year, you know, you often don't see a lot of specific disclosure about diversity, especially in the director skills and qualifications disclosure. But I think that that's going to change going into the upcoming 2021 proxy season, only because of the current climate. And, you know, people are, you know, really focused, hyper-focused, including investors, you know, institutional investors and activist investors are really hyper-focused on diversity and kind of the risk management that goes along with that. So I do think that companies are going to be more dialed into that this year. Still not totally sure just yet how far companies will go in disclosing specific identities of their directors. And that's always a touchy subject, because you may have just like a rock star diverse director who's just not comfortable, labeling themselves in a public disclosure. So, there's a fine line to balance that. But, as that disclosure becomes more required, obviously we would expect to see it a lot more. But this year, I do expect that we're going to see more diversity disclosure.
I agree with that. I don't have anything to add.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting topic, a crazy topic, in that the way to fix problems in this world, unfortunately, usually is transparency and is sunlight. And so that's why we have, some companies are going to have to bite the bullet and make the tough decisions. And I understand completely why you wouldn't want to label, because we're obviously human beings, and labels don't define us, and they shouldn't define us. But in a sense, they end up potentially defining us, because that's, some people see the worldview, and that's maybe all you know about somebody. Tough topic.
Yeah, I think we'll see more shareholder proposals in this space requiring D&I disclosures. If people aren't doing it now, they're going to get an invitation to do it. I'd expect to see more of that if companies don't voluntarily disclose. Folks like the New York Comptroller, I expect to knock on the door and ask why, or have a dialogue about it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.